I'm going to share with you what I've learned about Dart so far. I haven't been using Dart much, but has anybody used Dart in this room? Even heard of it?
Heard of it.
Okay, all right. And these slides, if you go to GitHub, at this URL, all the code examples that I have in the slides and a link to these slides are at that address. All right. So, what the heck is Dart? Well, it's a programming language developed by Google. And it runs in your web browser. Just like that thing we are familiar with, JavaScript. You can also run it on the server side, but I'm really going to talk more about the client side aspects of Dart. So why do we need yet another language? Well, it turns out that if you're doing client-side web application development, like think Gmail, like large-scale applications, writing code in JavaScript basically stinks. It sucks. Consider consider data types alone. If you have a large thing like Gmail and that's the application that you're trying to make a change to, understanding the ramifications of a change in just one chunk of code, you have no idea if you're in JavaScript, just simply because data types don't give you red flags from your compiler. And yes, there's lots of frameworks and tools and a surprisingly large amount of JavaScript libraries out there, but the real impetus for Dart is that client-side web applications really stink to develop in, especially if you have something large. And also Dart is being designed for the masses, you know, the average programmer. Not to say that we're dumb. I think they're just trying to make the language be familiar and have things that we expect, no surprises. I'm sure you've seen these talks, slide decks, just on JavaScript alone, all the things that are surprising, like all the things that do not equate that look like they should. So they tried to level some ground there. So that's kind of the idea with Dart. So you'll find all the usual things you would expect to find in a language, the standard control flow things. I don't want to talk about the things that you'll recognize. I'd rather spend most of the talk talking about things that are interesting in Dart and maybe different. So these are all the things that would be familiar. Dart is object-oriented. You can write classes, exception handling, built-in types, double, int, numerical, Boolean, string. That's it. If you want something else, you can write your own class for it. Everything is an object, so it kind of takes its cue from Smalltalk there. In fact, I think some of the designers came from that camp. Oh, and yeah, you get out of the box minimal set of collections, set lists, queue, map. And yes, you can do literal assignments. So if you're coming from an object-oriented language like, say, Java, where just creating a hash map, you have to do this very verbose stuff where you create the object and start adding things to it. So here, this is more like a lot of your scripting languages, Perl and such, where you can just make a direct assignment. So that's very nice. All right, so that's kind of the familiar things that you might expect out of a language. So here's a good place just to jump in, look at some actual code. I put a lot of string related things on this slide. Right away you'll see you can choose if you want to use double quotes or single quotes to denote a string literal. Choice is up to you. Like if you've got a single quote sitting in the middle, you might choose to use a double quote here. You might also notice that there is string interpolation. So whatever the value is of verb coming in, it will replace $verb with whatever you pass in, whether it's a string or an integer. And that's the other thing about Dart, which I wanted to point out on this slide, is that in Dart, types are optional. You only need to declare things string or int where you think it might be necessary. And places that you might be encouraged to do that are like on library interfaces where you do want to dictate what someone needs to pass to you, so you can have a very clear API or contract. But internally in your code, you know, you do not need to specify types at all. And that's what this var is. It is just a generic variable. It could be of any type. And I even thought that I could, back up here, find my, I don't have Dart right. Here we go. Let's try it again.
It's handy that it has the menu on one screen and
Yeah.
this on the other.
Okay, so here's that sample. And
Can you guys in the back see that okay?
I can try to zoom that up a little bit.
Yeah,
Maybe.
make it a little weird.
Is that better? Yeah. All right. All right, so here, case in point. If I'm expecting an int here, then the compiler is going to complain. And it's going to tell me, hey, you know, it looks like you're passing a string here, but you're expecting an int. But this is totally optional. And this is actually, this occurs at compile time. Once your code's been compiled, then all bets are off. But by that time, you should be good. So this is really a compile time warning. You can think of it that way. All right. Let's see what else. All right, I've really lost my slides here. That's what I get for doing split screen here. No. Let's try this way.
I'd help, but I don't think it helps to have more people.
Bear with me.
No, you're
I
fine.
apologize. Okay, the missing window. Okay. All right, we did collections. All right, back to our strings. On the interpolated variables, it's also possible to stick curlies in there, and now you can supply an expression. So in this case, verb is a string, and there's a 2 uppercase method available to the string object. So this will interpolate into the value that 2 uppercase returns. I would execute this code, but now I'm kind of scared to swap back out of this window. All right. Closures. Do people know what closures are? Yes. All right. Dart has closures. These 3 build greeters are functionally equivalent. I guess the punchline of this slide is that there's this little heavy arrow which is shorthand for open curly, return expression, close curly. So, and that, I think that heavy arrow shows up in a couple other languages. So the build greeter 3 here is just returning this closure. I also wanted to show that Dart, that the language itself supports UTF-16 characters, so you can throw anything, you could write your whole program in some other language if you really wanted to. So closures are there. Cascade operator, this is interesting. If you ever have an object and you're going to do a lot of things with that object successively, make assignments to it or call functions on it, once you have that object, you can use this ... cascade operator, and it will, if you notice, there's no semicolons on here. So I have a cartoon character object, and I'm doing an assignment to the name field, an assignment to the likes field, assignment to the catchphrase, and then I'm finally calling the act method. So it's just a shorthand way of doing a lot of things with the same object. Sort of like the builder pattern, if you're familiar with that, except that these things don't have to return an object, if you know what that's about. Optional parameters. In Dart, there is no function overloading, so you can't have two functions with the same name, but different parameters. Instead, they encourage you to use optional parameters. And there's two flavors of optional parameters. There's something called a named parameter and something called an ordered parameter. And I've got an example of each. So if we look at this build ice cream function, it's expecting a list of flavors to be passed, an array of flavors. And then we do an open curly, and these are optional named parameters. So in bowl and has sprinkles are both Booleans, and they're defaulted to false. So in my first call, I'm passing neither of those, so they will end up being false. In the second example, I set them both to true. The syntax for that is that you specify the name, colon, and then the value that you want to pass. And these do not require any particular order. In this case, I passed has sprinkles, but not in a bowl. So these are completely optional and independent from one another. So those are named optional parameters. The other flavor is a ordered optional parameter, and that's what I have down here for pay bill. You must have a parameter called amount, but there's an option to pass in a Boolean has loyalty card, and so I show both of those cases here. And the way that you test for the presence of this or not is you test it against null. If it's null, then it was not passed. Generics, Dart supports generics. This is pretty much what you'd expect. Here's a list. This list now can only contain strings, so you can assign a red, green, and blue to it, but you may not assign a number like you'd expect. Same with maps. There's a couple types. You can also write your own classes that are generic, type T, which is common in collections libraries. So Dart fully supports all that. Private variables. You know, it's kind of a theme in Dart to get rid of a lot of boilerplate and excess verbiage. If you've come from someplace like Java, you'd be familiar seeing things marked private and public and protected. Well, they do away with all of that. Everything is public. So my variables, name, like, catchphrase, these up here, these are all public. However, by convention, if I precede a variable name with an underscore, it's considered private. And that's the only distinction, just by convention. Yes?
So I say by convention, does the compiler enforce that or not?
Well, yes, the compiler does enforce it. I guess convention maybe is not the right.
Okay,
right,
I just
right
want to
word.
understand. Yeah, okay.
However, you might be surprised that you do not have, if you use an underscore in a variable inside of an object, privacy is not per object. Privacy is per library. So I've actually, on this slide, I have two files. There's a file, this cartoon and cartoon class. Those two things are in one file. And then down here begins my second file, and I import cartoon.dart, which contains this library. And it's only when you use variables with underscores inside a library that they become invisible to the person who's using that library. So in this case, if I'm down here in main and I've created a new cartoon character, I can call act because it's public. Act has no preceding underscore. However, I do not have access to these internal methods or member variables. So that is one little pitfall that you might fall into, is that it's on a per library basis, not on a per object basis. Getters and setters. I stole this example right out of Seth Ladd's blog. I think it's very succinct and gets to the point. Again, it's the reduction of boilerplate. Coming from a language like Java, getters and setters just eat up a bunch of time and space. Well, it turns out in this example, you have car, and a Boolean is engine running. In main here, where we are doing an assignment of true to car.isEngineRunning, that assignment is actually a setter. You need to conceptualize it as a setter. And likewise, when you retrieve the value, it's invoking a getter. You just don't have to write the setter in getter. In fact, it kind of runs the way you would think it would run. But what happens when you evolve your class car into something bigger and better in the future? Like our future car has an object called engine, and engine really contains whether it's running or not. So in this case, we would like to preserve our code out here in main that's still doing this assignment to true or reading to find out what its value is. How do we do that? Well, there's built-in keywords get and set, and now you can go write them. You didn't have to write them, but now you can. So in this case, we can write Boolean get is engine running, and we're returning the engines is running. And same with the setter.
Can you have a getter, or can you be async, just a getter or just a setter?
Yes, you can, yeah. Mix-ins. Does anyone know about mix-in inheritance? All right, I think this is kind of cool. I think of this as pick what you want, inheritance. Have you ever written a class and you wanted to assume some behavior, but you've already got a parent in your inheritance chaining? Well, it'd be nice if you could just bolt on some behavior, but yet write that behavior in its own class so that it's encapsulated on its own. So that's what this is. A mix-in is nothing more than a class, but there's a few rules here. If you're going to take this new mix-in class and sort of bolt it onto the side of your class, then you can't have, your mix-in class cannot have a parent object. So that means no constructor, no calls to super. And there's one other thing I'm forgetting. No, that's it. So you can't have a constructor, you can't have a parent object, and you cannot call super. And what does this look like? I did a flying pig example. Is this too small again?
Increase it slightly.
All right. So I got two pigs here, Wilbur and Pixie. Wilbur is a plain old pig, and if we look at the implementation of this pig, the only thing it knows how to do is it can be instructed to find truffles. So I print something so we can see who's finding truffles. Whereas Pixie is a flying pig. And if we look at the implementation of flying pig, it is nothing more than a pig, so it can also find truffles. I did an override of find truffles here just so I could print this extra line to prove that we were calling the flying pig find truffles. So we'll also say that this person had jet lag. But we also say with wings. Wings is our mix-in class here at the bottom. Is that visible? And wings has only one member function called fly to. So the purpose of wings, it only knows about flying to someplace. It knows nothing about truffles, nothing about pigs. Its concern, its behavior is only concerned about where to fly to. So I do want to run this one at the risk of losing my desktop again.
I could hum a little tune like
Yeah, all right. might call you for that. All right, here we go. So here's the mix-in example. If I say run this.
How do you turn that off?
That's okay.
We see our output, our first pig, Wilbur, found some truffles. Let's look at that main up here again. Oh, I can't, I'm zoomed here. And our Pixie is going to be first instructed to fly to southern France, and then he's going to be instructed to find truffles. So that's precisely what happened.
Don't mind me.
All right. So that's a mix-in. Yay. Okay. Isolates. Just like JavaScript, Dart is a single-threaded language, which is actually very nice when you don't want to concern yourself with shared memory state and protecting global memory between multiple threads. It makes reasoning about your code much easier. And what this looks like, there's a library called isolate, and you pass it a function. So here's a top-level function, run me, that's expecting an argument. So you say spawn that function, and here's the argument you're going to pass it. Now, because you don't have, because all of these isolates are completely isolated from each other, and they have their own stack and own memory, they cannot access each other's memory. You're expected to do message passing to do that. So it's actually typical, instead of passing this first argument here would be, there's something called a send port and a receive port, and you can use those to have two isolates talk to each other. So that's what you'd more typically see. Reflection. Here's what reflection normally looks like in a classical OO language. You start with the object itself, you call a function on it to get a class object, and then you can start digging to see all the meta information about that class. In a mirror reflection, there's a system level call where you take your object and pass it in, and it gives you back a separate object that you can then dig into it to find out all the meta information about the object in question. And why would we care to do this? Well, if you recall, Dart's really intended to be a client-side runtime compiled for running on the client side. And so things like distributing your code, you want to minimize. There's a lot of extra bytes in this classical way where all the meta information is attached to your object. If you can separate those, that's a lot of information you don't have to ship down to a client. And when you have mobile and limited bandwidth, this is kind of a big deal. So what would you do with Dart? Write client apps. And that's a whole other talk. I just wanted to point out that there's some good libraries out there, two in particular, Polymer and Angular Dart. If you know about AngularJS, which is another Google library, these Google guys talk to each other and say, hey, we like the features of Angular. Could we just do that in Dart? So they've actually done that. So if you wanted to write a Gmail type rich application on the client, these are the things that you would use in Dart to do it. That's it.
Do you guys have any questions for Broc?
Have you written anything, any applications, client applications?
I have written nothing of substance. I'm kind of sharing what I've learned so far.
What kind of got you into looking at Dart?
Because JavaScript really stinks. If you spent any time with JavaScript, you just want to pull your hair out. So, yeah. I think if I were to embark on a new project that's client side, I'd seriously consider trying it out in Dart.
What browsers accept Dart? Is it just Chrome, or does Firefox and?
There is a thing called Dart to JS. So Dart actually compiles to JavaScript, and it's actually very good. If you go look at some of the benchmarks they've got, they're kind of like in a race with the V8 team at Google. Who keeps making this thing faster. It's actually shockingly good. So yeah, it will compile to JavaScript. There is a Dart virtual machine, which when I was using the Dart editor tool, this is an Eclipse-based tool. It actually has the Dart VM so that when you're compiling your code, it's actually using the Dart VM because it's speedy quick. But you could actually use the Dart VM on the server side. So all that is possible. And they have said that you can expect Dart VM to eventually make its way into Chrome, although it's tough to get things into Chrome. They're kind of security minded, but I think it'll eventually be there. And then hard to say if other browsers will be inclined to include it or not. But yeah.
All right, well, thanks, man, I appreciate it.
All right, cool.